Before I go any further, I have issued legal proceedings through my solicitor KRW Law in Belfast against Sky News and Rachel Johnson, the sister of the erstwhile Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for egregious and grotesque libel uttered live on national television and not contested, let alone contradicted, by the person conducting the interview, one Trevor Phillips. I will not be saying anything more about this case until it comes to court, and anyone who's calling the show this evening should make no further reference to the case. I hope I've made that clear. Should that happen, we will have to cut you off immediately. A libel on live television in the middle of a crucial by-election campaign, it doesn't get much more serious than that. A much more serious case, however, does unfold in the High Court in London in the Strand this week, 20 and 21st of February. Julian Assange is a friend of mine. I thank the Lord that I am able to say that. Julian Assange is one of the great heroes of the 21st century. Julian Assange is the world's most important publisher, most important journalist, most important teller of the truth, which is why he spent nearly 5 years in a London dungeon, Belmarsh jail, built for mass murderers, child rapists and terrorists. This gentle man has been held in solitary confinement, subjected to gruesome and unrelenting prison oppression. Oscar Wilde had nothing on the trials of Julian Assange. He spent almost a decade inside the Ecuador embassy for fear that he would be extradited by Sir Keir Starmer, no less, to Sweden to face fake, invented charges of rape and sexual assault. He had to do that because he knew, I knew, and remarkably, some people who should have known did not know that the purpose of these allegations, the purpose of extradition to Sweden, was the quicker to extradite him into the maw of the US injustice system. I visited him many times in the Ecuador embassy. I sang Frank Sinatra to him from outside the window of the Ecuador embassy, just beside Harrods in London. I did not know that entirely illegally the CIA was spying on me and on all of Julian's other visitors. Even in the embassy toilet, we were being filmed and spied upon. And more importantly than his visitors, his legal team discussing his legal case and cases and the charges against him from the United States of America were also being illegally spied upon. They were being illegally filmed. It is almost unbelievable that any case could have been allowed to even proceed, let alone with the prisoners behind bars in Belmarsh jail, when it is now an admitted and accepted fact that the prosecution, the United States government, was illegally spying on the lawyers of the accused man and was then privy to every single aspect of his defense. In any jurisdiction in the whole world, that would be the end of the case, but not under British justice today. This case has not just been allowed to proceed. It has not just been allowed to proceed with the accused person unconvicted of any crime to be left languishing in that dungeon. But there's a very real danger that within a few days, the great journalist, the great publisher, the great truth teller, Julian Assange, will be on a plane to the United States of America, to a hanging judge and jury in Virginia, home of the CIA, and thence to 145 years in a supermax penitentiary from which we will never see his face or hear his voice again. It doesn't get any more serious than that. The reality is that these hypocrites in America, in Great Britain, were forever telling us how journalism is not a crime, but only if it's a journalist in trouble in a country that they don't like. I always ask them, did you ever hear of a man called Julian Assange? And they never reply. Every time they talk about a journalist from the Wall Street Journal in jail in Russia, I ask them if they've ever heard of a man called Julian Assange, but they never answer. Julian Assange is the world's #1 political prisoner because what he told us about were grievous political crimes committed by our governments in our name, on our dime, under our flag. He told us what the criminals were doing. And when the criminals get to imprison the people who reveal their crimes, then we truly are living in dystopian and criminal times. That's the long and the short of it. If Julian Assange is extradited this week, they'll have him on a plane before his feet can touch the ground back in Belmarsh jail. We'll never see him again. His little children will never see their father again except through a glass screen in a supermax penitentiary thousands of miles away. His wife will never kiss his face again, ever, except through a glass darkly. It is one of the greatest crimes of this century so far. Certainly the greatest crime against journalism, against broadcasting, against freedom of speech and expression, against the right of the citizen to know what is being done in his name at his cost. It will be a travesty of justice. Now, I have many times said, and I mean it, that whilst all of the institutions in this once proud Great Britain have been corrupted and hollowed out, in my experience, the judiciary is the least corrupted, is the least hollowed out. And so I have, throughout these proceedings, entertained the hope that the judges would find for justice, that the judges would rescue us from the shame that our government has placed us in this regard, as in so many others. I have gradually begun to lose hope as judgment after judgment went against my friend Julian Assange. But there is one last hope, and that one last hope is that the British judges this week decide to call a halt to this grotesquely expensive charade, this shame, this smear on our reputation, already so badly tarnished by so many other things, that the judges speak for Britain, speak for the free people of the world, and free Julian Assange this week, so that we can all kiss him at least one more time. How badly we miss him today. If he were here, if WikiLeaks under Julian Assange were here, we would know far more about the crimes being committed in the world by our governments. And amongst those, perhaps the greatest of those, certainly for 20 years, the greatest of those, is the fact that we are up to our neck in the slaughter in the Palestinian territory of the Gaza Strip. Keir Starmer not only whipped his members of parliament to vote against a ceasefire, he not only stated and repeatedly, and his factotums on his front bench echoed his words later that day and the next day, that Israel had the right to cut off water and electricity from 2.3 million captives in the world's biggest open-air prison camp, to use the words of Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron, uttered in Turkey more than a decade ago when he was Prime Minister. When Keir Starmer must have known, unless he's not really a human rights lawyer, unless he's not really a King's Counsel, must have known that Israel had no such right, that in fact such collective punishment is a breach of multiple international law, the laws of war, the Nuremberg tribunals, the Geneva Conventions, international human rights law, all outlaw collective punishment of 2.3 million people by plunging them into the morass of war, famine, pestilence, and disease, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But say it, he did, and he meant it, because when he told us that he supports Israel, quote, without qualification, unquote, he meant it. He didn't always mean it. I was present in a room in London only 9 years ago when he was on the platform calling for Israel to be kicked out of international football for racism. But 9 years later, he was certain that without qualification, he supported Israel. And everything that has flowed in British politics ever since has been predicated upon that without qualification support. He has used it ruthlessly to extirpate both his predecessor as Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and many of his most important allies, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Labour Party members who've been suspended and expelled for breaches of Keir Starmer's without qualification support for Israel. And a grossly disproportionate number of those members of the Labour Party who've been expelled and suspended have been Jewish members of the Labour Party. Jews don't have to be on the side of apartheid. As I've often explained, during my time underground for the African National Congress led by Nelson Mandela in apartheid South Africa, all of the people who helped me as I moved around underground were South African Jews, some of the great heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle, both inside South Africa and outside, were Jewish people who couldn't stomach apartheid. So everything that's happened inside the Labour Party is based on that statement of unequivocal, without qualification, fealty, loyalty of the leader of the opposition to the apartheid state of Israel. And it's coming back to haunt them. It's coming back to haunt them here in Rochdale. It's going to haunt them in Manchester Tameside. It's going to haunt them in the Bury constituency. It's going to haunt them in Oldham, in Bolton, and in Birmingham, and in East London, and in scores of constituencies all over this country. He may think that all these people are fools. He may think that by going to the rostrum at the Labour Party conference in Scotland today and finally saying there must be an immediate ceasefire, having kicked people off his front bench a few weeks ago for voting for an immediate ceasefire, he may think that these people are fools. But it's too little, Sir Keir, and it's way, way too late. And that's not a matter of chronology when I say it's too late. It's because 100,000 people are either dead or maimed or missing under the rubble in Gaza before you decided, finally, to call for a ceasefire and the end to the fighting in Gaza. It's actually 3 weeks since the International Court of Justice declared that plausibly Israel was committing acts of genocide and sent them for trial on that charge, and issued peremptory instructions to the Israeli government, all of which they have defied. 3 weeks. Sir Keir Starmer, KC, has still not responded to the decision of the International Court of Justice. 100,000 people's blood is on the ground in Gaza before you decided to call for a ceasefire. And if you think, Sir Keir, that is going to cut the mustard amongst the millions of people in this country who are deeply, vitally concerned with what's happening in Gaza. I met an old Englishman outside this studio here in Rochdale just before the show. He travelled quite some distance to shake hands with me and thank me for the 50 years of work that I have put in on this Palestine question, proving the personification of the lie that only Muslims care about what's happening in Gaza. Every Muslim cares, as you're going to find out, Mr. Starmer. But millions of others also care about children hanging on a hook with no legs and their life's blood drip, drip, dripping onto the concrete below. Millions of people care about little Hind, who was trapped in a car with her entire dead family, on the phone, saying her prayers, begging for rescue. And then Israel murdered her and the ambulance men that came to save her. If you think, Keir Starmer, that anyone's going to forget your role in this, if you think, Keir Starmer, that anyone's going to forgive your role in this, then you're not clever enough to be a King's Counsel. And you've been masquerading as a human rights lawyer all of this time. Julian Assange is the big story this week. But the slaughter, the genocide in Gaza City, in Khan Yunis, in Rafah, from Rochdale to Rafah, we reached out last night at an amazing event starring the great British rap artist, poet, philosopher, king, Low Key. We reached out from Rochdale to Rafah. We make no apology for it. We're proud of it. And I just want to close on this conundrum. Every single journalist and broadcaster who has covered the Rochdale by-election begins with a ritual denunciation of my having put the genocide in Gaza in the center of my election campaign. I started to ask the question, if this by-election had been taking place in 1940, in 1941, would these journalists and broadcasters be ritually attacking me for putting the Holocaust at the center of my election campaign? But by the time I reached the end of that question, believe it or not, maybe by divine countenance, I realized that the answer to that is actually yes. They would have. They did. These same newspapers denouncing me now were on the march with Britain's black shirts. Hurrah for the black shirts, screamed the headlines of Britain's Daily Mail back in the day. Those same newspapers, those same journalists didn't want to look at the Jews fleeing the Holocaust being conducted by the beasts of fascism. They closed their doors. They turned their backs. They looked the other way. Isn't it funny how some things never change? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. It's the mother of all talk shows.